Clara, what do you think you're doing? The words cut through the tense silence of the playroom, each one a shard of ice. Mark Harrison stood in the doorway, his $6,000 suit looking unnervingly crisp against the backdrop of childhood chaos. His face, etched with the fatigue of a transatlantic flight and a week of brutal negotiations, was a mask of cold fury. He had just walked into his Boston mansion, expecting a quiet homecoming, only to find this. His new wife, Caroline, stood frozen, her hand hovering near his 7-year-old son, Noah. The maid, Clara, was positioned between them, a human shield in a simple gray uniform. To Mark, the scene was obvious. The help was overstepping, undermining his wife's authority. He didn't see the terror in Noah's wide eyes or the way his other twin, Chloe, was pressed into the far corner of the room, small and silent as a frightened mouse. He only saw his perfect, elegant wife looking flustered, and an employee inserting herself where she didn't belong. Clara turned slowly, her heart pounding against her ribs. She kept her body angled to continue shielding Noah, who had started making a low, humming sound, his hands flapping near his face. "Sir, I was just," she began, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. "You were just what? Contradicting my wife?" Mark's voice dripped with disdain. He strode into the room, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the plush carpet. "Caroline is trying to instill some discipline, something these children desperately need. Your job is to clean this house, not to interfere with how we raise our kids." Caroline seized the opportunity, her expression shifting instantly from sharp-edged anger to wounded fragility. "Mark, darling, thank God you're home," she breathed, rushing to his side and looping her arm through his. "I was just trying to get Noah to stop making that noise. It goes on for hours and she," Caroline flicked a dismissive glance at Clara, "jumped in as if I were hurting him." Mark's jaw tightened as he looked from his poised wife to the disheveled maid. The contrast was stark. Caroline was perfection, a porcelain doll of high society. Clara was the help. He had made his choice months ago, and he would stand by it. "He's not hurting, sir," Clara said, her voice quiet but firm. "He was just stimming. It's how he copes when he's overwhelmed." "I don't pay you for psychoanalysis, Clara," Mark snapped. "I pay you to follow instructions, and the instruction is that Caroline is in charge of the children. Are we clear?" He looked down at Noah, who was now rocking back and forth, his eyes squeezed shut. The sight sparked a flash of irritation in Mark, not pity. Why couldn't he just be normal? Why was everything so difficult? It was a disloyal thought, and he hated himself for it, which only made his anger toward the situation worse. He had buried one wife. He wasn't going to let his children's issues destroy his second chance at a life. "Sir, please just look at Chloe," Clara pleaded, gesturing with her head toward the corner. Mark's gaze followed, and for a half-second, a crack appeared in his armor. Chloe was chewing on the collar of her dress, her knuckles white as she gripped a small, smooth stone in her hand. Her eyes were vacant, fixed on a spot on the wall. She looked like a soldier in shell shock. But then Caroline squeezed his arm. "She does that when she wants attention," she whispered, her voice a sweet poison. "If you ignore it, she stops." Mark chose to believe the poison. It was easier. It was simpler. He turned his cold gaze back to Clara, his decision made. "This is your final warning. Do your job and stay out of family matters. If I see you undermining my wife again, you'll be out on the street before the end of the day. Don't you ever get between my wife and my children again." He didn't wait for a reply. He guided Caroline out of the room, his arm protectively around her, leaving Clara alone with the two silent, terrified children. The click of the door shutting echoed like a gunshot. Clara knelt, her own pain forgotten, and gently pulled Noah into her arms. The little boy was rigid with fear, his humming the only sound in the suffocating silence. In the corner, Chloe hadn't moved, her small form a statue of misery. Clara looked from one child to the other, a wave of cold dread washing over her. The master of the house had seen, but he hadn't understood. He had looked, but he was completely blind. And in his blindness, he had just locked the cage and handed the key to the monster. 8 months earlier, the mansion had been a different kind of silent. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, the kind that follows a funeral. Eleanor, Mark's first wife, had been the home's vibrant, beating heart. She understood the twins in a way Mark never could. She knew that Noah's humming was his version of a song, that Chloe's fascination with smooth stones was her way of holding on to something solid in a world that often felt chaotic. After a sudden aneurysm stole her from them, The silence she left behind was filled with a gaping void. Mark, a man who built skyscrapers and commanded boardrooms, was utterly lost within the walls of his own home. He retreated to the only battlefield he knew, his work. He left for his downtown office before the children woke and came home long after Clara had put them to bed. He told himself it was necessary, that he was securing their future, but it was a lie. He was running. The playroom, once a place of laughter, became a territory he avoided, a painful reminder of Eleanor and of a paternal language he didn't know how to speak. It was during this period of self-imposed exile that he met Carolyn. She was introduced to him at a charity gala, a stunning art consultant with a razor-sharp wit and a smile that could disarm armies. She listened to his clipped, impersonal story about being a recent widower with 2 challenging children, and her expression was a perfect symphony of compassion. She didn't offer platitudes. Instead, she spoke with a calculated practicality that appealed to the businessman in him. "Children need structure, Mark," she'd said, her voice smooth as silk. "Especially children like yours. They need an unwavering routine. It makes them feel safe." It was exactly what he wanted to hear. She wasn't offering messy, complicated emotions. She was offering a business plan for his broken family. The courtship was less of a romance and more of a merger. He saw in her a solution, an elegant and efficient executive to manage the domestic branch of his life that had fallen into disarray. When he proposed 3 months later, it was with the same pragmatic finality with which he closed a billion-dollar deal. Clara saw the truth from the very first day Caroline moved in. When Mark was home, Caroline was the doting stepmother, all soft-spoken words and gentle hands. The moment his town car pulled out of the long, winding driveway, the warmth vanished from her eyes, replaced by a cold, appraising stare. She would watch the children with a faint look of disgust, as if they were flawed pieces of art she had been forced to display. The first red flag came a week into the marriage. Noah was having a good day, using his speech-generating device to say the word blue over and over while pointing at his favorite block. Caroline watched for a moment, then walked over and took the device away. "We need to encourage him to use his real voice," she announced to Clara with a tight smile. "This thing is just a crutch." Clara saw the confusion and panic well up in Noah's eyes as his only reliable voice was taken from him. "Mrs. Harrison," Clara said gently, "his therapists say the device is a bridge to verbal communication, not a replacement." Caroline's smile didn't waver, but her eyes turned to steel. "And I say he's capable of more. We just have to push him." That was Mark's original sin. He came home that evening, and Caroline presented the incident as a triumph of her new strategy. "I'm challenging him, darling," she explained over dinner. "I truly believe he can speak if we just stop coddling him." Mark looked at his son, who was silently pushing food around his plate, and felt a surge of hope. Maybe she was right. Maybe what the kids needed was a firm hand, not the soft touch approach Eleanor had always used. He chose to believe in the quick fix she was selling. He endorsed her decision, praising her insight. He ignored the worried look on Clara's face and the fact that his son didn't look challenged, but defeated. In that moment, he wasn't just a grieving husband making a mistake. He was a father actively choosing to abdicate his most fundamental responsibility. He outsourced his children's well-being to a stranger because her promises were more convenient than the difficult, patient work of actual parenting. He put his signature on a deal with the devil, sealing the fate of his own children to protect the fragile peace of his new life. Following Mark's public humiliation of Clara, the atmosphere in the mansion grew colder, more oppressive. Caroline, now emboldened by her husband's unwavering support, escalated her campaign of quiet terror against the children. Her cruelty was a poison administered in slow, calculated doses, always just out of sight. She began locking the twins in the playroom for what she called quiet time, sometimes for hours on end. She'd remove all the stimulating toys, leaving them in a barren room with nothing but their own spiraling anxieties. "They need to learn to be calm," she would explain to the other household staff, her voice dripping with false concern. "All that noise and flapping is just a cry for attention." Under this new regime, the children began to wither. Noah, who had been making fragile progress with his communication device, abandoned it completely. He regressed into a profound silence, his only expression a constant, low hum that seemed to be a barrier against the world. Chloe's sweet disposition curdled into a constant state of high alert. She developed a nervous habit of pulling at her own hair and would have intense, silent crying spells. tears streaming down her face as she rocked herself in a corner. Clara's heart broke a little more each day. She tried to intervene, to create small pockets of safety for the twins. She would sneak their comfort objects back to them. Noah's worn, soft blanket and Chloe's collection of smooth gray stones, only for Caroline to discover them and confiscate them again. "These are just crutches holding them back," Caroline would say, dropping the precious items into a trash bag with a look of triumph. Clara confronted her directly one afternoon after finding Chloe hiding under her bed, trembling. "Mrs. Harrison, this is hurting them. They need comfort, not punishment." Caroline turned from the mirror where she was applying her lipstick, her eyes flashing with venom. "You are the maid, Clara. Your job is to clean up messes, not make them. My husband has made it very clear that I am in charge. If you bring this up again, I will not hesitate to have you fired for insubordination. Do you understand me?" The threat hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Clara was trapped. To lose her job meant losing her ability to watch over the children at all. She was their only witness, their only secret protector. Caroline's manipulation of Mark became an art form. She was masterful at twisting reality. One evening, Mark came home to find a large, ugly scratch running down Caroline's forearm. "Oh, darling, it was awful," she said, her lower lip trembling. Noah had a complete meltdown. He just lashed out. "I didn't want to tell you, I know how much you worry." Mark, looking at the scratch, felt a familiar mix of guilt and anger. He went to the playroom and found Noah huddled in a corner, his face tear-streaked. He grabbed his son by the shoulders, his grip tighter than intended. "Did you do this? Did you scratch Caroline?" Noah flinched, pulling away from his father's touch, a fresh wave of silent tears spilling down his cheeks. His reaction, born of fear, looked like guilt to Mark. He had accepted the lie. He didn't know that Clara had seen the whole thing from the hallway. Caroline had been trying to wrench Noah's favorite blanket from his hands, and when he wouldn't let go, she had scratched herself on the corner of a wooden toy box in the struggle, a sudden, wicked idea forming in her eyes. "I just don't know if I can handle them when they get like this," Caroline whispered to Mark later that night in bed. "Perhaps we should start looking at other options, schools that are better equipped for their needs." The seed was planted. The endgame was revealed. She wasn't trying to discipline the children. She was trying to get rid of them. For weeks, Mark clung to the fiction Caroline had so expertly crafted. It was a shield against his own guilt and a justification for the chilling emptiness that had begun to define his home. He told himself the silence from the playroom was a sign of progress, that the children's withdrawn nature was a temporary phase of adjustment. He accepted the stories of tantrums and small acts of aggression because it was easier than accepting the truth of his own neglect. The lie was his sanctuary, but the foundations of that sanctuary were about to crack. It happened on a Tuesday night. Mark was in his sprawling home office, a glass of scotch in his hand, trying to unwind from a tense conference call with his Tokyo division. He couldn't shake a feeling of profound unease that had been gnawing at him for days. He pulled up the monthly household expenditure report on his monitor, seeking the familiar comfort of numbers and spreadsheets, a world where everything made sense. He scanned the figures, his eyes catching on a series of unusually large payments. One was for $15,000 to a Dr. Alistair Finch, child behavioral specialist. Another was for $10,000 to something called the Serenity Grove Therapeutic Center. Caroline had mentioned them, of course. She'd explained them as necessary, cutting-edge therapies she had meticulously researched to help the twins. "They're the best, darling," she had said, her hand on his arm. "And the best is expensive, but the children are worth it, aren't they?" He hadn't questioned it then. He'd simply signed the checks, relieved that she was handling it, that he could solve this problem the way he solved every other, by throwing money at it. But tonight, something was different. A cold, sharp splinter of suspicion had lodged itself in his mind. On a whim, he opened a new browser tab and typed, "Dr. Alistair Finch, Boston." The search results were sparse. There was no professional website, no listing in any medical directory, no published papers. There was only a bare-bones corporate registration for a consulting firm at an address that, when he looked it up on a map, turned out to be a mailbox rental store in a strip mall. His blood ran cold. He then searched for the Serenity Grove Therapeutic Center. The first result was a news article from a year ago about a fraudulent chain of clinics that had been shut down by the state for operating without licenses. Mark leaned back in his leather chair, the glass of scotch forgotten in his hand. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a lie. a calculated financial deception. It wasn't about a difference in parenting philosophy. This was fraud. It was a language he understood intimately. He had built an empire on sniffing out bad faith and deceit in business deals, yet he had let it run rampant in his own home. He stood up and walked to the door of his office, looking down the long, shadowed hallway toward the children's wing. He could hear a faint sound, a soft, rhythmic thumping. He followed it to Chloe's room. Peeking through the slightly ajar door, he saw her sitting on the floor in the dark, gently knocking her head against the padded leg of her bed. It wasn't violent. It was a desolate, lonely sound, a sound of profound distress. And in that moment, he didn't see a challenging child having a tantrum. He saw his daughter, his little girl, lost in a world of pain he couldn't comprehend. He saw the result of his blindness. He returned to the master bedroom and looked at Caroline, who was sleeping peacefully, an image of serene beauty. But for the first time, he wasn't looking at his perfect wife. He was looking at a complete stranger, and a single terrifying question echoed in the silent chambers of his heart. What else have you lied about? The flimsy dam of Mark's denial had been breached, and now a flood of cold, hard suspicion washed over him. Sleep became an impossibility. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the fraudulent invoices from the phantom doctors, followed by the haunting, rhythmic image of his daughter gently thudding her head against her bed in the dark. It was a silent scream, and he had been deaf to it for months. The rage that began to simmer in his gut was not hot and explosive, but cold and methodical. He was a man who dismantled corporate raiders for a living, who could spot a weakness in a balance sheet from 1,000 yards. He had been played not in the boardroom, but in his own home, and he would approach this problem as he would any hostile takeover, with overwhelming force, meticulous planning, and zero emotion. Confronting Caroline now would be a strategic error. She was a master manipulator, and she would twist his accusations into a paranoid fantasy, painting him as the unhinged, grieving husband. He needed more than suspicion. He needed irrefutable, undeniable proof, the kind of evidence that would stand up in a court of law, and, more importantly, in the court of his own conscience. The next morning, he made a call that was reserved for only the most severe corporate crises. He didn't call his lawyer. He called Arthur Vance, the head of his company's global security. Arthur was a former FBI field agent, a man with a face like carved granite and an unnerving ability to find the truth in a hurricane of lies. Mark trusted him implicitly. They met in a sterile, soundproof conference room downtown. "Arthur," Mark began, his voice devoid of its usual command, replaced by a flat, dead tone. "I have a situation at my home. I believe my wife is committing financial fraud against me and possibly endangering my children. I need a full covert investigation. I want eyes and ears inside my own house." Arthur listened without a flicker of expression, his silence more comforting than any words of sympathy would have been. He simply nodded. "We'll install a new security and climate control system, state-of-the-art. Micro cameras, audio recorders. They'll be invisible. We'll have a team on it by noon." While Arthur's team, disguised as tech installers, swarmed the mansion, Mark initiated the second phase of his quiet investigation. He needed human intelligence. He found Clara in the laundry room, methodically folding the children's clothes. He closed the door behind him. "Clara," he said, his voice low. She flinched, expecting another reprimand. "I need you to be completely honest with me. Your job is secure. You have my word. Whatever you say will be protected." "How are my children?" He saw a war of emotions in her eyes, fear, loyalty, and a desperate, pleading hope. Her resolve crumbled. "They are not well, Mr. Harrison," she whispered, tears springing to her eyes. "They are afraid. She locks them in the playroom. For hours. She calls it quiet time. She takes their things. Noah's blanket, Chloe's stones. She says they're crutches, but they're all they have." Each word was a nail hammered into the coffin of Mark's ignorance. He didn't press her for more. He didn't need to. He just nodded, a muscle twitching in his jaw. "Thank you, Clara. You did the right thing." Next, he found his longtime chauffeur, a man named George, who had been with him since before the twins were born. As they drove to a pointless meeting Mark had scheduled as a cover, he asked casually, "George, those new appointments Carolyn has for the kids. Dr. Finch, Serenity Grove. You must be driving her there quite a bit." George hesitated, his eyes meeting Mark's in the rearview mirror. Sir, to be honest, I've never driven Mrs. Harrison to any doctor's office. The addresses she gives me are always in the Back Bay shopping district. Usually she has me wait while she goes to the spa or to Neiman Marcus. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture of monstrous deceit. For the rest of the week, Mark lived a lie. He sat across from Caroline at the dinner table, listening to her cheerful anecdotes about her day, her fabricated stories of the twins' progress, all while the rage inside him coiled tighter and tighter. He felt like a stranger in his own life, a spy in the ruins of his family. On Friday evening, he received a secured email from Arthur. The subject line was a single, ominous word: package. Mark went to his office, locked the door, and clicked the link. The video that filled his screen was from a camera hidden inside a smoke detector in the playroom. The quality was brutally clear. He watched Caroline enter the room where Noah was sitting on the floor, humming softly and rocking back and forth. Her face, when she thought no one was watching, was a mask of pure, undiluted hatred. "Stop that disgusting noise," she hissed. She moved with a predator's speed, snatching the worn blue blanket from his hands. Noah let out a choked cry, reaching for it. She held it out of his reach. "You are a freak," she whispered, her voice a venomous dart. "A broken little freak." She then tossed the blanket into a trash can, turned, and walked out, locking the door behind her. The video continued, showing Noah crawling to the door, his small hand scratching at the wood. Mark watched the silent, grainy footage until the screen went dark, but the image was burned onto the back of his eyes. The last remnants of his doubt evaporated, consumed by a white-hot certainty. This was not a misguided woman. This was not a flawed stepmother. This was a monster wearing his wife's face, and his quiet investigation was over. It was time to plan the execution. The trap was set. For 3 agonizing days, Mark moved through his life like a phantom, a ghost haunting the opulent halls of his own mansion. He was a perfect actor, playing the part of the devoted, slightly oblivious husband. He complimented Caroline on her dress, asked about her day, and listened with feigned interest to her fabricated reports from the non-existent therapists. Each lie she told was a fresh twist of the knife in his gut, but he showed nothing. His face was a placid mask betraying none of the glacial fury that was hardening his soul. He was waiting. The video evidence was damning, a clinical, digital record of her cruelty, but he needed more. He needed to witness it himself, to see it unfold in real time, to feel the poison in the air. He needed the memory to be visceral, undeniable, a brand on his conscience that would fuel him through the war that was to come. On Friday morning, he kissed Caroline goodbye. "The jet's waiting," he said, adjusting his tie. "A sudden crisis with the Chicago development. I'll have to stay overnight. I should be back tomorrow evening." "Oh, darling, that's a shame," she said, pouting prettily. "But business is business. Don't worry about a thing here. I'll take perfect care of the children." The words were a vile mockery, but Mark simply smiled. "I know you will." He didn't go to the airport. George, his trusted chauffeur, drove him 10 blocks away to a luxury hotel suite that Arthur Vance had already converted into a high-tech command center. A massive screen dominated one wall, split into a dozen silent, full-color feeds from every key room in the mansion. Arthur was there, a silent, imposing presence. "Lev feed is secure, sir," he said. Mark just nodded, sinking into a leather armchair, his eyes fixed on the screen. The wait was excruciating. He watched as the afternoon bled into the evening. He saw Clara patiently trying to coax Chloe into eating a few bites of dinner. He saw Noah sitting in the corner of the playroom, rocking back and forth, a lost little ship in a vast, empty sea. Then, at 7:13 p.m., the action began. The feed from the master bedroom showed Caroline, dressed in a silk robe, pouring herself a glass of wine. She was on the phone, pacing. Arthur flicked a switch, and her voice, sharp and laced with contempt, filled the hotel room. "I'm telling you, Susan, it's a nightmare," she said. "The little freaks are impossible. I can't stand the noises they make, the way they just exist." Mark's hands clenched on the arms of his chair, his knuckles turning white. "But it's almost over," Caroline continued, a triumphant lilt in her voice. "Mark is completely convinced they need to be in a full-time institution. He's so wrapped up in his grief and his business he barely sees them anyway. A few more months of playing the devoted stepmom, a few more incidents, and he'll be begging me to sign the papers. Then it's just me, this house, and his American Express black card." The confession was more brazen, more sociopathic than he could have ever imagined. Arthur glanced at him, but Mark's face was unreadable, carved from ice. His eyes were glued to another feed, the one from the playroom. He watched as Caroline ended her call and stormed out of the bedroom, her face a mask of irritation. She marched down the hall and burst into the playroom. "What is this mess?" she shrieked. A cup of apple juice lay on its side, a small puddle soaking into the expensive Persian rug. Chloe, who had knocked it over, froze, her eyes wide with terror. "I've told you 1,000 times to be careful." Caroline's voice was a whip. She grabbed Chloe by the shoulders, her perfectly manicured fingers digging into the girl's fragile frame. She began to shake her, violently, Chloe's head snapping back and forth. "You are a useless little mistake. You ruin everything. Why can't you just be normal?" That was the moment Mark broke. He was out of the chair, moving before he even registered the decision. "Get the car," he snarled at Arthur as he sprinted for the door. The 10-block drive back to the mansion was a blur of red lights and blaring horns, but he was too late to stop what came next. Back in the playroom, Caroline raised her hand, her palm open, ready to strike the terrified child. But before the blow could land, a blur of gray shot across the room. Clara, who had heard the shouting and had come running, threw her own body in front of Chloe, shielding the little girl. "No!" Clara's voice rang out, filled with a righteous fury that defied her position. "You will not touch her. You will not harm this child." Caroline recoiled, her face contorted with shock and rage at the maid's defiance. "How dare you!" she screeched. "You're fired. Get out of my—" Her words were cut short. The playroom door crashed open with such force that it slammed against the wall. Mark Harrison stood in the doorway, his chest heaving, his face a terrifying canvas of absolute fury. He hadn't just heard it on an audio feed or seen it on a screen. He saw it all right there with his own 2 eyes. The scene was burned into his memory for eternity. His wife, the monster, poised to strike. His daughter, cowering in terror. And the maid, his humble, underpaid maid, the only true parent in the room, standing as a defiant, loving shield. In that instant, the entire elaborate world of lies he had constructed around himself didn't just crack. It was obliterated. The sound of its destruction was the deafening roar of his own heart, finally awakening to the catastrophic, unforgivable truth of his failure. The revelation was complete. The air in the playroom crackled, thick with a silence more violent than the preceding screams. Caroline stared at Mark, her face a grotesque collage of shock, fury, and dawning panic. The mask of the grieving widow and the caring stepmother had been ripped away, revealing the naked, ugly face of the monster beneath. Mark's gaze was not hot. It was arctic. It was the same look he gave a rival CEO just before a hostile takeover, a look that promised not just defeat, but complete and utter annihilation. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words were quiet, precise, and deadly. "Arthur," he said, speaking into the still open line on his phone. "Code black. Asset removal protocol. Now." Caroline's eyes widened. She knew what that meant. She had heard him use the term once before when he'd had a corrupt executive physically removed from the company headquarters. "Mark, darling, this is a misunderstanding," she began, her voice a desperate, syrupy plea. "The maid, she's lying. She's been trying to turn you against me. Be silent," he commanded. The words were not a request. They were a judgment. 2 large men in dark suits, men Caroline had never seen before, appeared in the doorway behind him, their presence filling the frame. They were part of Arthur's team, always on standby. Mark's eyes never left Caroline's. "You will leave this house. You will take nothing but the clothes you are wearing. Your cards have been canceled. Your accounts have been frozen. The prenuptial agreement you thought was so ironclad has a nullification clause for gross misconduct and endangerment of my children. My lawyers will be in touch with yours. You will never see me again. You will never see my children again. If you ever come within 500 feet of this family, I will use every dollar I have to ensure you spend the rest of your life in a small, dark room." He stepped aside, a silent gesture to the men. Panic turned to feral rage. "You can't do this," she shrieked. "I am your wife. You were a business arrangement that has been terminated due to a breach of contract," he said, his voice flat and empty. As the security men stepped forward, Caroline lunged not at Mark but toward the children, a final, spiteful act of possession. But Clara was faster. She swept both Noah and Chloe behind her, a lioness protecting her cubs. The men took Caroline's arms in a firm, unbreakable grip. She was dragged, kicking and screaming obscenities from the room and out of their lives forever. The sudden silence that descended was profound. All the rage, all the cold fury, drained out of Mark in a single devastating rush, leaving him hollowed out, an empty shell. He turned his gaze from the empty doorway to the three figures huddled in the corner. Clara stood guard, her arms wrapped around the two trembling children, and for the first time he saw it clearly. The terror in his children's eyes was not just a lingering shadow from Caroline's attack. It was for him. They were looking at him with the same fear they had looked at her. In that moment he understood that he wasn't their rescuer. He was just the other monster, the one who had let the first one in. The weight of his failure, of months of willful blindness and callous neglect, came crashing down on him. The mighty Mark Harrison, the titan of industry, the man who could move markets with a single phone call, was brought to his knees. He didn't just kneel, he collapsed, his expensive suit crumpling to the floor, as if his bones had turned to dust. A sound tore from his throat, a raw, ragged sob that was half grief, half self-loathing. "I'm sorry," he choked out, the words thick and clumsy in his mouth. "Oh God, I'm so sorry." Tears, the tears he hadn't shed even at his first wife's funeral, streamed down his face, carving paths through his carefully constructed facade. "Daddy failed you. I failed you. Forgive me." He didn't move closer, knowing his presence was a threat. He stayed on the floor, broken and weeping, making himself small, stripping away every ounce of his power and authority. He was just a father, a failed one, begging for a mercy he didn't deserve. He saw Clara whisper something to the twins, her voice a soft murmur. After a long moment, she slowly led them out of the room, giving him the space he needed. When he finally looked up, she was standing in the doorway alone. "Clara," he said, his voice hoarse. He fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking. He didn't get up. He stayed on his knees and made a call to his personal banker. "David," he said into the phone, "I'm creating a new trust. The beneficiary is Clara Mendez. Fund it with $5 million from my personal accounts. Effective immediately." He ended the call and looked up at her, his eyes red and raw. "You're not an employee anymore. You're their guardian. Your family. Whatever you want, whatever you need, it's yours. Just don't leave them." Clara simply nodded, her own eyes filled with tears, not of pity for him, but of relief for the children. Mark made one more call, to his executive assistant. "Diane, cancel everything. My entire schedule for the next 6 months. The Chicago deal, the Tokyo merger, all of it. Delegate it, delay it, or kill it. I don't care. I'm not available." He hung up the phone and let it clatter to the floor. The great sacrifice wasn't the money. It was this. He was laying down his armor, abandoning the battlefield where he was a king, to enter the one place where he was a complete and utter failure, his home. The first act of his penance was complete, paid not in words, but in action. 6 months later, the Boston mansion was unrecognizable. The cold, sterile silence of the past had been replaced by a low, gentle hum of life. The minimalist art gallery aesthetic Caroline had imposed was gone, replaced by a world of soft textures, vibrant but calming colors, and functional, child-centric spaces. The cavernous, formal living room, once a showcase for expensive, untouchable furniture, was now a state-of-the-art sensory gym. A large swing hung from a reinforced beam in the ceiling, brightly colored crash pads were piled in a corner, and a weighted blanket lay draped over a large beanbag chair. This was Mark's new world, his new boardroom, the only one that mattered. The first few weeks after Caroline's expulsion had been a brutal, humbling education. Mark had thrown himself into the task of fatherhood with the same relentless intensity he had once reserved for his business empire. He quickly learned that his fortune was useless here. He couldn't delegate this. He couldn't buy a solution. He had to show up. He sat through hours of therapy sessions, not in the waiting room but on the floor next to his children, learning from the occupational therapists and developmental pediatricians he hired. He learned that Noah's humming wasn't a noise, but a form of self-regulation, a way to organize the sensory chaos of the world. He learned that Chloe's smooth stones were grounding objects, anchors that made her feel safe. Guided by Clara, who had gracefully transitioned from maid to the undisputed matriarch of the household, Mark learned the silent language of his children. He learned to anticipate a meltdown, not by what was said, but by the subtle shift in Chloe's posture or the increased tempo of Noah's rocking. He learned to sit in silence, offering not solutions or demands, but simply his quiet, unwavering presence. There were days of crushing failure, days when his mere presence would send Noah into a spiral of anxiety, or when Chloe would retreat so far into herself that she was unreachable. On those days, he would see the ghost of Caroline. He would feel the full, crushing weight of his monumental failure, and he would have to fight the urge to retreat back to the safety of his office and his spreadsheets. But he didn't. He would stay, absorbing their pain, honoring their fear, and quietly promising to himself that he would earn back their trust, no matter how long it took. He dealt with Caroline with swift, impersonal finality. She was a hostile asset to be liquidated. His lawyers presented her with the mountain of evidence, the fraudulent invoices, the video recordings, Clara's sworn testimony. Faced with the threat of criminal charges for fraud and child endangerment, she signed every document put in front of her, vanishing from their lives with a fraction of what she had hoped to steal, her name and face becoming toxic in the social circles she so desperately wanted to conquer. Now, on a bright, crisp autumn afternoon, the evidence of his redemptive labor was everywhere. Mark was on the floor of the sensory gym, patiently helping Noah build a tower of soft, oversized blocks. Noah was focused, his brow furrowed in concentration. He placed a final blue block on top, and the tower stood tall. A slow smile spread across the little boy's face. He looked at Mark, then reached for his communication device, which was always by his side now. He pressed a series of buttons, and the device's clear electronic voice spoke a single perfect word: more. It was more than a request. It was an interaction, a connection, a bridge across a silent gulf. A year ago, that bridge had been dynamited. Now, brick by painstaking brick, Mark was helping him rebuild it. A small weight settled against Mark's side. Chloe, who had been watching from the beanbag chair, had quietly moved to his side, leaning against him as she ran a smooth gray stone over the back of her hand. She rarely initiated physical contact, and the simple act of her choosing to be near him sent a wave of warmth through his chest that no billion-dollar deal ever had. He resisted the urge to hug her, knowing it would be too much. Instead, he simply relaxed, accepting the gift of her presence. He tilted his head and started to hum, a low, soft tune that Eleanor used to sing to them. It was a melody he had almost forgotten. Chloe's hand stilled. She looked up at him, her eyes clear and present. Her lips parted, and she made a sound, a soft, breathy syllable that was almost a word. "Da," she whispered. Mark's breath caught in his throat. It was the first time she had made a sound in his presence in almost a year. It wasn't daddy, not yet, but it was a start. It was everything. Clara watched them from the doorway, a serene smile on her face. She held a tray with 3 glasses of apple juice, a silent witness to the miracle she had helped orchestrate. Mark caught her eye and gave her a small, grateful nod. A new family had been forged in the crucible of pain and betrayal, redeemed not by grand gestures but by thousands of small, patient acts of love. Mark Harrison finally understood. His life's greatest work wasn't the skyscrapers that pierced the clouds or the numbers that filled his bank accounts. It was this. It was the fragile, priceless trust in the eyes of his children, a treasure he had almost thrown away forever. He had been a billionaire, but he had been spiritually bankrupt. Now, sitting on the floor of a playroom with a humming boy on one side and a silent girl on the other, he was finally, truly, the richest man in the world, and this was a fortune he would protect with his very life.